Well, hello, welcome back, my cool cats and my gremlins. Welcome back, Period 5 review. We got the exam coming up pretty soon. I will say that this Period 5, there's a lot of information, goes from about 1844 all the way up to 1877. So that is pre-Civil War, Civil War, and Reconstruction. So we're going to try to blast through this as fast as possible. All right, so key concepts in the beginning of this chapter is about manifest destiny, the movement westward. Remember, manifest destiny is all about the movement westward, but that's not just the 1840s. That really is a theme that we can trace back to the colonists back in the 13 colonies, always trying to push past the frontier. And as we continue, Louisiana Purchase, Adams-Onis Treaty, then in this chapter, okay, we talk about manifest destiny reaching Texas, Oregon, California. Okay, Texas was annexed. Remember the story of Texas? We briefly touched on it in period 4. I said it was more of a story for period 5. Although Texas will be eventually annexed or added on to the Union of the United States, it was an issue for a long time. One, because it didn't belong to us. They technically were their own sovereign nation for a brief period of time. And the reason we didn't want to get involved is because of the issue of slavery. Although John Tyler, president, was the one who actually should get credit for annexing Texas, he does not. The Manifest Destiny president, James Polk, does instead. So what makes him the Manifest Destiny president? Well, basically, we not only acquire Texas, we will get to California and Oregon country as well. Okay, so there's a lot of land that he gains in his presidency, and we'll just take a look at the map of before and after his presidency. So, manifest destiny. Okay, what does it mean? Manifest meaning your belief to do something, and destiny that is written in the stars, that is bound to happen. So what we believe as Americans and what we feel as we're entitled to is that we believe we should have this entire North American continent from sea to shining sea. Please remember that you can see in the middle of the screen there, John O'Sullivan, 1845. He's the guy that coins this term. Definitely throw his name in there if you're going to mention the term manifest destiny. Little brownie points there. And as I said before, there are plenty of examples leading up to the 1840s of manifest destiny. Even after this chapter, we can synthesize manifest destiny with topics like imperialism or the space race. So definitely know manifest destiny and how we can connect it over the course of time. The problem is, as we move westward, there is an issue of slavery. So, side note, I also would know this picture. We analyzed this picture in class. The focal point being the angel. She's moving westward. She's moving towards the darkness. She seems to be carrying some sort of a holy book, probably the Bible. She's bringing civilization with her. And also, you see the natives and the buffalo running away. So just a very iconic picture that you may see on the exam. Now, skipping here, some of the issues, some of the main territories we gain. Oregon country. If you remember back in period 4, we mentioned the Anglo-American Convention of 1818. The foreign policy guru of good old John Adams, his son, the Secretary of State, who is going to gain all this territory for us, but the problem was we will jointly occupy this territory with England. But that was a 10-year deal. That time is up, and now Americans want all of Oregon country. And so James Polk says, hey, listen, 54-40 or fight. We're willing to fight for this territory. You see a lot of Americans taking the Oregon Trail up there, and it will come to a head, but without war involved, which is good. And the Oregon Treaty of 1846 basically divides the territory in half and says England can get the northern portion and the Americans can get the southern portion. That 49th parallel is where America and Canada today are split in half. All right, infamous slide right here, beef with Mexico. So what's the deal with Mexico and Texas? Let's just revisit some of the story here. Texas, although no longer part of Mexico, remember they're their own sovereign nation. Before they were annexed by the United States, they were still viewed as part of Mexico. Mexico is very bitter. Even after it is annexed by America, they still are going to be sore at us because of losing Texas. And Polk will reach out to Mexico and say, hey, listen, let us just buy, California from you and other territory instead of going to war. And he sends this mission, the Slidell mission, to offer $25 million to Mexico for California. And Mexico says, no, we're not going to sell it to you. We don't really like you guys. We're upset about Texas still. And what you're going to see Polk, president, send Zachary Taylor, future president, into the disputed territory between Mexico and Texas. And you're going to see, we're going to claim that they start shooting at us, and this begins this Mexican-American War. Now, it's kind of sketchy, obviously. That story obviously doesn't really make a lot of sense, and that's on purpose because we don't actually know who shot the first shot. And that makes a lot of people wonder, well, who exactly started this? And a lot of people are going to raise questions, like this young congressman in Illinois, that guy right there on the right, Abraham Lincoln. He issues his what we call spot resolution. He says, show me the spot where they shot at us, and I will be okay with the story. And essentially, they cannot produce that spot at where it all went down. The Northern Whigs, okay, this political party that rose out of the Andrew Jackson era, kind of like your more modern day Federalists, they are not in favor of the war. They believe this is a Southern attempt to expand slavery. Remember, heading westward, issues of expanding slavery as well. You see this congressman from Pennsylvania issue the Wilmot Proviso, which basically says, how about this? We basically know we're going to win the war against Mexico, and when we do gain all this land and territory, why don't we just say right now all that land is banned slavery? Well, the South does not approve that, and so the Senate will reject it, and it doesn't happen. The Wilmot Proviso doesn't go through. So you take a look at the map here. The war was a landslide victory for the United States. Very short war. The Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo is the one that wins, or the treaty that wins. The war, if you will. And we gain all this territory, about 1/3 of the size of the United States today, and future states like Texas and a little piece of Oklahoma, California, Nevada, Arizona, New Mexico, etc. So a lot of land we gain. You can see on the left side of your screen here, all of this land, all this territory was gained during the Polk administration, Texas, Oregon, and the Mexican Cession area. Problem is, as we add on more land, the issue of slavery winds up taking hold of national politics as we enter the 1850s, getting closer and closer to the Civil War. So we know the issue of slavery is going to wind up hurting us in the end. And the failure of compromise is going to make things even worse. So let's talk about some of the movements now that we have this land from Mexico. The Free Soilers are a new political party. What the Free Soilers believe in is they say that this Mexican cession land should be free soil, free labor, and free men. They don't necessarily, they're not abolitionists, but they don't support the expansion of slavery. So definitely know the Free Soilers are. They're a very important political party. A figurehead, if you will, or a person to associate with this party would be Abraham Lincoln. He has this mentality, even though he's going to become what we call a Republican in a couple of years in 1854. He does have this mentality, even though we kind of consider him an abolitionist because of what he does later on. He is a free soiler. He just doesn't want to see the expansion of slavery. Brings us to 1848, the presidential election. As we know, slavery is kind of dooming national politics. And you see the candidates here. Lewis Cass, Democrat, Zachary Taylor, Whig, Martin Van Buren. He's back to try to run again as a free soiler. We just talked about their position on slavery. And because the Whigs take no stance on slavery, that's the reason Zachary Taylor wins this election. Then all of a sudden, something good and also kind of bad happens in 1849, the California Gold Rush. People start rushing out to California because they think they can get rich quick off of gold that is discovered. Now, with an influx of people coming into California, well, that means California is now going to be our next hotspot or our next territory that says, hey, listen, we want to become a state. Problem is, we need to have that balance between free and slave states. And that's what brings in Henry Clay once again, the compromisers of all. And he comes in with his Compromise of 1850. He says a couple of things here. California, you're in as a free state. Congratulations. Point number 2, the rest of the land, the Utah and New Mexico territories, we're going to allow popular sovereignty to rule those lands. Popular sovereignty, big vocabulary term, must remember, basically says that we're going to allow the people in those territories to vote and decide on whether or not they want to become slave or free states. Point number 3, you must know. No more slave trade in Washington, D.C. That's pretty significant, very symbolic, right? Our capital. And finally, point 4, the new fugitive slave law. And that's going to be a point of emphasis and a point that the Northerners are going to not like about this compromise. Okay, and so a very controversial part of this Compromise of 1850, as already mentioned, the Fugitive Slave Act or law. This is not the only fugitive slave law we've had. It was actually in the Constitution. However, it wasn't very strict. It didn't allow for Southerners to go to the North to get their slaves. So this act is a little bit different and a little bit stronger, and Southerners like this a lot more because it did allow them to go to the North. And now Northerners are firsthand seeing these Southern plantation owners come into their backyard and say, that's my slave. A lot of the times, they weren't even their slave, they were just saying they were. And one of the injustices of this system was that judges were paid more money to rule in favor of the Southern plantation owner than setting the slave or potential slave free. And so this was a very controversial law, and a lot of Northerners don't like this law, and it intensifies the abolitionist movement. Speaking of the Northern resistance, the abolitionists, don't forget the Underground Railroad. There you go, right there on the right. That's Harriet Tubman. She leads a lot of slaves to liberty, not only to the North, but also Canada. You're going to see a lot of committees set up, like the vigilance committees, to protect fugitive slaves from slave catchers. But obviously, if you're caught harboring a fugitive slave, that can mean possible jail time or a significant fine for you. So that's not good either. That leads us to our next controversial legislation. That's the Kansas-Nebraska Act. That's where things kind of start to really unwind here. And Kansas-Nebraska territory, you look at the map there, right in the middle of the country, it's basically what is left of the Louisiana Purchase that is still not organized. And you have this senator from Illinois, no, not Lincoln, but you have his rival, Stephen Douglas. He wants something for his state. He wants to build the Transcontinental Railroad from his state of Illinois out west. Problem is, how are you going to get Southern congressmen to vote for this? Why would they want to appropriate money to a northern state for a transcontinental railroad? So Stephen Douglas comes up with an idea. He says, hey, listen, vote for my railroad. In return, what I'll do is I will give you this Kansas-Nebraska Act. I will allow popular sovereignty in these two territories. As you can see, these two territories are, past that dividing line, that 3630 line from Henry Clay's 1820 Missouri Compromise that said no slavery above this line. You're now possibly allowing slavery to expand north of that line, which is a huge change in law. And Southerners overwhelmingly agree with this. They say, yes, we like this, and the Kansas-Nebraska Act now becomes our next point of emphasis where things, like I said, start to unravel. Side note, the Missouri Compromise is going to be, thrown out the window, and also you're going to see now the Republican Party form as a result of this. They are going to be very against this Kansas-Nebraska Act, and as we said, our poster boy for the Republicans is the same as the poster boy from the Free Soilers. That would be Lincoln. So the Kansas-Nebraska Act, like we said, allowing popular sovereignty, allowing the people in those territories to vote on whether or not they want to become free or slave states. You're going to see a battle basically in Kansas, whereas they want to become a state. And you're going to see people called border ruffians, or people that jump the border from places like Missouri to Kansas to try and flood into the area to try to get more people on the side of slavery. And there's going to be a vote, and it comes down to a lot of fighting back and forth. And because we see a boycott of the free soilers in Kansas, that means obviously the people that want slavery are going to win. If they boycott, that's not good. And now this bleeding Kansas is going to, spill over big time with a lot of people dying. And that's thanks to this guy right here, good old John Brown, crazy white dude who decides to attack a lot of people in, pro-slavery people in not only Lawrence, but in Kansas in general. Him and his sons are going to hack up some people with axes, and he is going to be a symbol of this, anti-slavery fight for bleeding Kansas. In the end, though, like we said, the Free Soilers boycott the vote, and that means the pro-slavery people win. That means Kansas looks like it's going to become a slavery state. President Buchanan, what do you think about all this? He says, hey, listen, not only do I have a sweet faux hawk, but also I do agree with that was the rules, that was supposed to happen, and you guys boycotted, that's your loss. It goes to a vote in Congress. Congress rejects the vote. So now the question is, wait, what's supposed to happen now? I thought popular sovereignty was, the law, and you guys were going to allow us to have that. Well, no one really knows the answer because what's about to begin, the good old Civil War. Before we get right there, we got to talk about good old Dred Scott right here. Dred Scott was a slave whose owner took him into free Wisconsin territory. He said, listen, when I die, I'm going to set you free. His owner dies. Dred Scott says, awesome, I'm free. Well, the brother-in-law who inherited the Dred Scott owner's all of his money and possessions, he says, no, Dred Scott, you're my slave. Dred Scott says, I'm going to sue you for my freedom. In the end, you have to know this case, Dred Scott versus Sanford. It comes down to the Supreme Court saying, sorry, Dred Scott, you are a slave. You're not even a U.S. citizen. You don't belong in a U.S. court. You have to remain a slave. You were property. You are going to still be considered property. They say no more Missouri Compromise. It's unconstitutional. So just because you were above the 3630 line doesn't mean you're free. Which is very dangerous for a lot of slaves. And it also said that Congress cannot make laws on slavery in territories. Wisconsin was a territory at this time. So only states they have jurisdiction about slavery, not territories. Okay, so on top of Dred Scott's decision, here comes John Brown, once again, the guy from Bleeding Kansas, and he has this crazy idea that he is going to basically start the Civil War. He believes he is hand chosen by God to start this. And what he does is he has this great idea to go to Virginia, see Harper's Ferry, which is a federal arsenal, a place where they store weapons. Him and his sons are going to kill the guards, take over the arsenal. The slaves in the area are going to come to his aid. He's going to give guns to the slaves, and they're going to take back the city and even possibly start a civil war to abolish slavery. What actually happens, him and his sons go to Harper Ferry, they kill the guards, they take the guns, not one slave comes to his aid, they are scared of the consequences, and then you're going to see the National Guard or the National Militia, I should say, be called in by the command of a guy named Robert E. Lee, who we're going to talk more about in a little bit, and John Brown is captured and later put on trial and then hung. He is seen as a martyr by the Northerners. The Southerners think that the North had put him up to this, but he only intensifies the feelings or the sectionalist feelings between the North and the South as we head to 1860. One last attempt to prevent all of the inevitable, basically, the Civil War, the Crittenden Compromise, the last gasp effort to avoid the major crisis. They said, hey, listen, why don't we return the Missouri Compromise idea of the 3630 line? Nothing above that line can be slave from here on out. Everything below must be slave. Lincoln, okay, who is the newly elected president in 1860, says, no, I'm good, no thank you, and that means more states are going to secede from the Union. What caused them to secede from the Union in the first place? Don't forget the election of Lincoln. As soon as he is elected, the South thinks that he is going to abolish slavery, South Carolina being the first state that does. A couple others will follow, and they are going to form the Confederate States of America. On the top right there, those states that are in the little light blue, those are going to be called border states, and we'll talk about their importance in a little bit. The first shots of the Civil War happen in 1861 in March, not too long after Lincoln was inaugurated. He gets a FaceTime from his boys in Fort Sumter who said, "Hey Lincoln, please help us out. We're running out of supplies. We're going to die in here if you don't help us." Lincoln Snapchats his friend Jefferson Davis, who is the president of the Confederacy, and he says, listen, my boys just need some food and supplies. Is it cool if I send them some food and supplies? I'm not sending reinforcements. And Jefferson Davis says, yeah, absolutely not. Not cool. And they open fire on Fort Sumter, and the first shots of the Civil War are now underway, and Fort Sumter will fall to the Confederacy. Now, talking about Lincoln's priorities, obviously he is going to want the country to be together. That obviously is not going to happen for a while. As soon as he is elected, the South Carolina and then other states will follow. His priority is to get them back into the Union. His priority is not to abolish slavery. His priorities are also including those like orangish states, those peachish states on the map there. Those are called border states, as mentioned before. He needs those states very, very much because they have men, they could fight, they have industry, which could help the South. Remember, the South is an agricultural-based society, and with more industry, that can help them with war. And also the strategic importance of places like Maryland, because that's where Washington, D.C. is, and we don't want the capital to be surrendered to the Confederacy. It's kind of game over. So what Lincoln is going to do, he's going to take a lot of measures to ensure that he doesn't lose those border states. He's going to do things like declaring martial law in Maryland, which is having the military come in and basically nobody's allowed in or out of the city. He's going to suspend habeas corpus. If you remember, that's your right to due process. That means you can be thrown in jail without being told why. He's going to do this to ensure that people that could be pro-slavery sympathizers are thrown in jail. He's also going to allow guerrilla warfare in Missouri, which, as we know from the Revolution, is kind of that hit-and-run tactics, that unconventional style of warfare. So Lincoln, we don't usually think as doing things not really against the rules, but kind of like not to the book. He does do things almost out of character to ensure that he does not lose this conflict. And obviously, if he lost, that would be a big blow. All right, so we really fast forward through basically the Civil War. We don't really talk about battles. So what we are going to talk about is not only the causes, but really the effects of the war. So let's put it side by side. What kind of advantages or disadvantages the North have? First of all, they had the industry that's good for manufacturing war goods. They have the transportation of the railroads. They have a powerful navy. They have the government. They have the population advantage, and they also have emancipated blacks, almost citizens, but not yet. Disadvantages: the reason that the war goes on for 4 years is that they have a lack of leadership. Robert E. Lee, the man, the guy who should be the commander of the U.S. Army, he goes to the South. He is a states' rights guy, and Virginia is where he's from, and so he says, "Listen, my loyalty goes with Virginia, and that means the Confederacy." There's also a lack of purpose. Lincoln, remember, is not fighting to end the institution of slavery. He is fighting to preserve the Union. And many soldiers are kind of like, well, I don't really know what that means, so what am I fighting for? And so that's another reason. Now, the South, what do they have? They're fighting a defensive war, which means they know the terrain, they have the purpose, right? They're fighting for their way of life, not just slavery. They have the veteran military officials from like the Mexican American War, for example, guys like Robert A. Lee. They have cotton diplomacy, so they have like a bargaining chip when it comes to luring other countries into the war, to stop trading cotton with them. The disadvantages: they don't have the government, they don't have the navy, they don't have the supplies, they don't have the railroads, and they don't have that manufacturing or strong economy like the North, and so that's their big disadvantage. But they almost pulled it off. We are going to see conscription acts for both sides, which means the draft. Problem is, the draft seems to really attack people who didn't have wealth because you couldn't pay your way out of the draft. So if you were wealthy, you could pay yourself, you could pay for a substitute, or in the South, what you could do is if you had X amount of slaves, over a couple hundred slaves, you can get out of fighting the war. Halfway through, about 1863, after a huge win at the Battle of Antietam, you're going to see the Emancipation Proclamation be issued by Abraham Lincoln. The misinterpretation of the Emancipation Proclamation is that everybody thinks this is what frees slaves. That is not true. It does not free slaves in the border states. Remember, the border states had slaves in them, and a lot of people forget that when talking about the North versus the South. They think, okay, the North is all about anti-slavery, and the South is all about pro-slavery. Not kind of true, because the border states, they fight for the Union, but they have slaves in them. So again, the Civil War is not just about slavery. Anyways, the Emancipation Proclamation says all slaves that are in the Confederacy are now freed. Lincoln is hoping that the freed slaves or the emancipated slaves will help rally, a war cause for the Southern, now freed slaves, either to run away to the North, join the army and fight, and give more of a purpose for the Northerners fighting in the war. This paves the way for the 13th Amendment, which does abolish slavery in the entire country, and that's after the war, though. It also knocked out the possibility of Europe getting involved in the war because those countries had already abolished slavery. Why would they help the South fight for slavery, an institution that they had already abolished years before? Lincoln's executive power dramatically expands during the war. This is often correlated with guys like Woodrow Wilson in World War I or FDR in World War II, Lyndon Johnson in Vietnam. You see executive power expand dramatically, and we usually see concurrently happening is that citizens' rights decline or get restricted during that time. So what did Lincoln do to expand his power? Well, he orders blockades without the approval of Congress. He suspends habeas corpus, as we talked about. He increases the size of the army without the approval of Congress. He declares martial law. And at the same time, we said when you suspend habeas corpus, you see people being thrown in jail without a trial, and that is a suspension or a limit on people's rights. So that is a common theme. So the official surrender at the Appomattox Courthouse comes in 1865, where Robert E. Lee, he surrenders to Grant, and this is what we consider the end of the Civil War, which then leads us then to the next topic, and that's Reconstruction, the post-Civil War era. So the questions that we have to answer is, how do we bring the South back into the Union? Remember, Lincoln never considered the South to have left, but how do we bring them back? Do they have to agree on something? Do they have to swear on something? What is it going to be? How do we physically rebuild the South, because most of the war was fought in the South? How do we integrate this new group of people in our country who, now are no longer slaves? There's a lot of questions there. And then what branch of government should control the process of Reconstruction? And that was something I really tried to focus a lot on in class this year, as far as what branch had control of Reconstruction, how it shifts from one branch to the other. Okay, so answering some of those questions, first off, we have the Freedmen's Bureau is created in March 1865, which is going to try to help that new group of people, the freed slaves, with getting some land. So the original purpose was, let's give these freed slaves 40 acres and a mule, so they have land to cultivate, right? Makes sense. That's the only thing they know how to do. And the other thing it's going to do is actually set up and build a lot of schools to educate, to make these people literate, which is a huge step and a huge success of the Freedmen's Bureau. The big failure with the Freedmen's Bureau was that 40 acres and a mule became unrealistic, because they could not take 40 acres from these plantation owners in the South and give them to former slaves. The South would probably just continue the Civil War. So that rarely happened. But the biggest success of the Freedmen's Bureau was the education and the literacy that came out of it. Next, what you're going to see is the Southern reaction is going to be a lot of response to what the North is trying to do to make these people, bring them into our country and make them productive members of society. You're going to see secret societies like the KKK be established, and that's not going to be good for the South. Different plans for Reconstruction. Obviously, Lincoln doesn't make it to see Reconstruction. His plan was going to be a lenient plan, where he's going to only ask 10% of voters in southern states to pledge a loyalty to the Union. They must accept the 13th Amendment of Emancipation, and that was it. There was no hoops to jump through or anything like that, and this was a lenient plan. Wade Davis' plan was a congressional plan where they were going to require 50% of the state's voters to pledge allegiance to the Union, and this is much tougher than Lincoln's 10% plan. Lincoln had pocket vetoed, or basically just never signed, let it expire on his desk, and so we go with Lincoln's 10% or lenient plan. Then if he dies, what is Andrew Johnson going to do? And that was the big question. Andrew Johnson, Lincoln's vice president, is going to, at the time, just continue Lincoln's 10% plan until he loses control of Reconstruction, which we're going to see about in a minute. So for now, we go lenient. We say that the South must adopt the 13th Amendment, and then they can become a state back into the Union once again. The 13th Amendment, got to know that amendment, abolished slavery. This happens before the 14th and 15th, which we'll talk about in a moment. But unfortunately, the South is not just going to, it's the 13th Amendment and allow things to go back to normal. They are going to enact black codes, which are kind of the same as slave codes, where they're going to prohibit African Americans from doing certain things like owning or borrowing land, or forcing them to sign labor contracts, which is basically slavery. And they can't leave that contract before it expires. They can't serve on a jury or vote. And you're going to see a lot of African Americans have no choice, because they don't know what else to do. they only know certain skills from farming in the past, and so you're going to see these slaves become what we call sharecroppers, which is like your American version of feudalism, where they have to borrow or work on someone's land and farm and cultivate it, and in return they have to give or share a portion of their crop to the plantation owner. President Johnson, how does he lose control? He is going to have some disagreements with Congress. You're going to see him and Congress have a falling out, and this is going to lead to that transition between the executive branch having power of Reconstruction to the legislative branch. So let's talk about the fallout. President Johnson, he vetoes the Freedmen's Bureau, but then Congress overrides his veto. Remember that checks and balances does allow that to happen. And then another bill, another civil rights bill, which would have granted citizenship to African Americans, 14th Amendment, is also vetoed by Andrew Johnson. And Congress also overrides that veto. So this is very rare that we see multiple bills overridden by Congress, because it's very hard to happen, and you're starting to see the fallout. Congress is obviously not on the same page as Andrew Johnson. And the nail in the coffin for Andrew Johnson is going to be when he actually removes a person from the cabinet, and that would be one of Lincoln's people, the Secretary of War, Edward Stanton. And Edward Stanton was not allowed to be fired because of a new law that was passed, which was called the Tenure of Office Act, which said the president cannot remove them from office. But obviously, that was made to protect Lincoln's cabinet, and Andrew Johnson removes him. That means he breaks the law. When the president breaks a law, they can be brought to trial. We call that impeachment. And Johnson is impeached, and the 2/3 of the House required vote to impeach Johnson falls one vote shy, so he does remain president, but he loses all power basically. He's not going to run for another term, so he is basically relinquishing his power of Reconstruction to Congress, and there we see the first transition of Reconstruction from the executive branch to the legislative branch. Okay, so let's wrap this up. Talking about the Reconstruction or the Civil War amendments. You got to know all three of them. We talked about the 13th Amendment, which was emancipation. The Emancipation Proclamation paved the way for that 13th Amendment. What paved the way for the 14th Amendment? Cases like the Dred Scott decision, and obviously, what are we going to do with this group of people? We must make them citizens, so we don't have another Dred Scott situation. They are allowed to be protected, equally protected under the law and entitled to due process, although we're going to see the South try to get around that. And also, along with the 14th Amendment, okay, we're going to see the 15th Amendment later on. Congressional Reconstruction, here's what it looks like. Take a look at that map. You can see the 5 military zones that the South was broken up into after the Civil War was over. We had troops down there to essentially keep an eye on the South to make sure that they are allowing these new slaves to exercise their freedoms, like the 13th Amendment and now the 14th Amendment. You're going to see the 10% of voters pledge their allegiance, like we saw in Lincoln's plan, and they're going to all rewrite their state constitutions to be readmitted to the Union. Now, all three Reconstruction Amendments are there. We are going to finally see the 15th Amendment, which is universal male suffrage. All three of these amendments you must know. Just think logically that they must go in order in the sense of you can't vote without being a citizen. You can't be a citizen without being freed from slavery. All right, so definitely know these three amendments. Finally, what brings Reconstruction to an end? This is a really good little piece to throw in your writing if you're trying to write about the end of Reconstruction, the Compromise of 1877. 1876 is an election year. We have the governor from New York, Samuel Tilden, who's a Democrat, running up against the Republican from Ohio, Rutherford B. Hayes. You have to win the Electoral College, remember, in order to win the presidential election. Tilden wins the popular vote, means nothing. There are 4 states that are too close to call. That means a recount must follow. So a little commission is set up to recount the votes, and the commission that is set up are mostly Republicans. Guess who wins the election then? The Republican Rutherford B. Hayes. And the South, who is predominantly Democrats, say, no way, we're not allowing this guy to be president unless we get something out of it. So we see a compromise. No, sorry, Henry Clay is gone. He's dead now for a while. This is not his compromise. This compromise will say that Rutherford B. Hayes will be president and the South is going to get the 3 things in return. 1, they're going to remove the troops from the South, which basically ends Reconstruction because now the South is going to have all these literacy tests, black codes, KKK on the rise, and do all these things to get around restricting African Americans' rights. You're going to see number 2, a Southerner named to Hayes' cabinet, and number 3, more money being approved to help the South rebuild after the Civil War. This ends Reconstruction really because the troops leave the South, and now the South is on their own, and they can basically go back to being and doing whatever they want now that the Civil War is over. So there's a lot of information in this unit, in this period. I would not be surprised if your DBQ is on this topic. Really try to pay attention to some of the big vocabulary terms and people within this topic. Definitely know a lot of the legislation, know the biggest themes like we talked about, Manifest Destiny and slavery, Civil War, Reconstruction. And we will do more practice with this in the future. But other than that, that is it. Peace out and have a wonderful day or evening or whatever life. Peace out.